So can everybody see that?
Yeah.
So I'm going to start off with a map. And the problem that we had was, can we take an area of the map of a particular community in Cumbria and draw about a boundary around it, like this one? So that's Arnside parish boundary. And could we calculate which roofs receive enough sunlight in order to be able to be suitable for a solar installation? And most importantly, can we do it with publicly and freely available data? And the answer is yes, we can. And I wanted to talk about the two types of data that we use first. So the first set of data is Ordnance Survey building shapes, and you'll just see them here, also in red. And these are part of the Ordnance Survey open data set. And these basically show approximate boundaries of buildings. They're not actually very accurate, but they give us a good starting point as to where to locate those buildings. So I'll just zoom in a little bit to a more central part of Arnside and put those buildings on so you can see them a bit more clearly. Now
We're all trying to spot our homes.
I've clipped a few off there. And then the second type of data I want to show you is a bit more complex to explain. This is three-dimensional data, and it's called Lidar data, and this is it here. And this shows kind of on a 1 by 1 meter grid points on the map as to how high they are off the ground. So you can see we've got almost the top of Arnside, not there, and then going all the way down the hill into the town and further down to the darkest areas, and then finally into the sea where actually the data doesn't exist. So the lowest lying areas are dark in the way that I've presented things, and the highest ground is light. So hang on. So just to zoom in much further, this is the area around St James's Church, and you can see that 1 meter grid, if you like. Each point on the map represents a 1 by 1 meter square pixel, if you like, and you can represent that as an image, and that's what we're doing. And so you've got St James's Church and some of the buildings around it, and you can actually already start to see the shapes of the building roofs. For example, the so the scale is slightly different to the first map that I showed you, but the lightest area here is the roof ridge, for example, on each of these buildings here, and the darker areas as the roof slopes away, and then the street level down here. And you can almost, I think you can see parked cars, which were whatever day this image was snapped. But what I've also done here is to grab a screenshot from Google Maps, just for the purposes of this presentation. And if I just flick between them, you can see they're roughly aligned, but Google Maps does a slightly annoying thing. Well, I think they're slightly misaligned by a couple of meters. But anyway, you can certainly see just this roof ridge here does in fact correspond with the ridge of the church. And you can see over here, you can see a large tree. And if I flick back to the image, you can actually see that represented as well on the map. So you've got vegetation in there as well. So what we can do here is we can try and reconstruct these roof shapes, and we can also see what shadows are cast over the map by vegetation and surrounding structures, and other items on the map, and the hillside, yeah, the landscape around particularly. So I'll have a little bit more of a look at how that's represented in terms of a three-dimensional map. That's a very similar view, similar area. You're looking side on almost, at a fairly bleak angle towards St James's Church here, over on the right hand side, and the houses around it, and even that tree just here. Now this data is it's not very high resolution, so that 1 meter by 1 meter grid does miss a few things. This 3D map isn't perfect in terms of the way it's generated, but you get the general idea here. Hang on, let me just so I'll just move into this next slide, and I'll just take you on a tour around the parish. So obviously, Arnside Knot itself casts a fairly big shadow over the town in the evenings, I'm guessing, and also you get a certain amount of shadow from as you go down this hill here. You can see there's going to be a certain amount of shadow as one building gets in the way of another in terms of certain times of day when the light is shining. Now you'll know that better than I do. Just a different look from above here. Just try and get a sense of that from above here. And just try and fly over those buildings a little bit. So it's quite a hilly parish. One, I think, probably the steepest slopes I've seen on a parish that I've done so far, within the parish itself.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a bad thing in the sense that that shadow, for example, there'll be a building up here that's casting a shadow down here, will reduce the amount of sunlight that's available for solar. Now it's not terrible. And as you'll see, there are a certain number of buildings that do come out in the calculation as suitable. So, but it does have an impact. Mm-hmm. And just one final 3D reconstruction. That 1 meter grid over St James's Church. You can see, if you're not convinced, that we can produce a roof shape from that data. I think these are the parked cars along the street down here.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I'm probably the least scientific person on this call, right? So, so when I'm looking at the colours, I mean the gradations of light to dark.
Yeah.
Are these a certain time of day?
No, this is nothing to do with the time of day. This is simply, so I mean, the way this data is captured is it's captured by DEFRA, and I think they're mostly interested in flooding. Right. And so they've got a kind of 10-year project they've been that's kind of ongoing, that captures data. It's kind of analogous to radar, and then they capture that 3D image by flying planes over most of the UK. Okay. But this is just simply the height above the ground in that 3D image, if you like. Right. At each point on that 1 meter grid. So I haven't done anything with that data yet. This is just representing it so you can see what it looks like.
Okay, fine. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's okay. It's good to see it in 3D at least. But now, hopefully, that gives you a better idea. And then onto the algorithm, and the algorithm is, I mean, it's not like a Facebook algorithm. It's not mysterious and kind of that nobody understands. It's essentially just a big long computer program that makes a calculation. So you can make a calculation. You can program this as a straightforward calculation, and in fact, that's how it's done. Yeah, so it's essentially the job of the algorithm to calculate those roof shapes and then use geometry to work out how much sunlight they might receive over the course of an entire year, and to see whether they meet the threshold for solar installation. And there are essentially 4 stages to this algorithm. And the first one is simply to try and identify flat areas on building roofs from that 3D data. So what we're doing is looking at adjacent pixels and trying to look at slopes on the roof and seeing if we can identify a single roof shape where all the pixels or pixel slopes, if you like, are pointing in the same direction. So we don't know anything about the roof other than what's in this 3D data. Now the second part of the algorithm is to calculate the shadow falling on each of these roofs from other buildings and vegetation, hills, other structures. And essentially we discard those that are in too much shadow. We also discard roofs that are too small for solar, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later. And any of those roof shapes that are pointing in the wrong direction. So if you've got a north facing roof, that's immediately disqualified from solar. And then finally we use kind of geometry and like historical weather conditions to estimate how much sunlight lands on each of those roof areas and work out how much energy you might get from each roof over the course of a year. So there's two things going on here. One, you're making a calculation as to how much sunlight is falling on each pixel, if you like, and the second one is we're trying to carve this up into roof shapes and then eliminating those ones that don't meet the criteria. Now the work for that was done, for the actual algorithm was done by a student, Alex, and he talked directly to solar installers as to things like what the minimum threshold for size was and what angles in terms of north or what aspect, what are those, which of those angles sort of northeast, southwest are suitable and which aren't, and then finally you've got a pitch on the roof as well as to what angle it's pointing at, and that does affect things as well. So when we've gone through that elimination process, what we find is, and these are the results, what we find is we find there are, well, initially there are 877 individual building shapes from the Ordnance Survey, and from those there are 914 roof areas, which is actually more roof areas than there are actual roofs, because what we're doing is carving things up here to find individual areas. And in total, they're calculated to produce a total of 3.3 gigawatt hours of electricity over the course of a year. Now that's just a number, I realise that, but that will align somewhere in terms of the electricity, power generation and power usage figures. And you can then make a comparison as to, is that all the energy that you use in a year, all the electricity, or is that just part of the electricity? I don't have the figures for Arnside, but I know that with Ambleside it was they kind of aligned pretty well with how much electricity was used in a year. Right, sorry, bit mouse trigger happy there.
How do you find that information out then?
I think the electricity company is Electricity Northwest where you are, and I assume you are if they're sort of funding all this. I imagine they'll have the details, so I think Alex would have gone to them. So I actually want to break this off and hang on, just share a couple of different things. So this is so what we get from this is that list of roof areas, and I'll go into in a bit more detail later, but I want to show you what you actually receive as a community from this. And can you see a spreadsheet here?
Yep.
So this is like a detailed spreadsheet of each of those roof areas, and each of these lines represents one roof area that I'll show you on the map very shortly. There's a whole load of technical data in these columns here, so they're not, you probably won't find those particularly of interest, but we've got the Ordnance Survey coordinates of each roof here, so they're pretty precise in the sense you know where that roof is. And then you've got the number of solar panels that are calculated to fit on each of those roof areas, and then the total output for each roof. And I'll be referring to this as I go along. And each of these roof areas, we assign this like ID number from 1 down to 914, which is the, and 1 is essentially the biggest roof, and 914 is essentially the smallest roof that we identify. The second thing I want to share is the map, and I have got this on video, but it's actually easier to do it right. So there's your map. So this is live on the web now, so you can go and look at this if you want to. And this is your map of roof areas. So if I zoom in, and the quickest way to do that is with your mouse wheel, if you've got one, if you're using desktop and you've got a mouse with the mouse wheel. So that's the top tip. And we can drag and pan around the map just by clicking on the map and dragging it around. Now this map is, the background is based on OpenStreetMap, so that's open data available for us to use. And each of these little purple areas, I'll zoom in a bit further. Let's go to the central area around, excuse me, around St James's Church again. So these little blobs, if you like, these purple blobs that are on the map represent, each of those represents a roof area that's calculated by the algorithm to be suitable for solar. And if you look carefully, most of them are on sort of south-facing, south sides of buildings, or particular roofs.
I can see my roof.
Sorry?
I was going to
see
say
my roof.
Yeah.
See
Is this yours, Rebecca?
Mine's there, yeah.
And so what you can do is you can drag and pan around here, and if you hover over one of these roof areas, you'll see a pop-up. If I just hold that there, you can see that this little roof area that I've picked at random has an ID number of 87. So you'll be able to cross-reference this to your spreadsheet, and then you'll be able to see, you'll be able to look that up later. And you can see that this particular roof area is ID number 87. So it's one of the bigger roofs, and you've got the coordinates there. And then the number of panels calculated to sit on that roof, and the total output over the course of a year. So that's 6 megawatts of electricity output over the course of, 6 megawatt hours over the course of a year. And I can do this with any of these roofs. So if I look at a very small roof, maybe this one here, then the ID numbers start to get smaller. And if I look at one of the bigger roofs, sorry, I didn't hold for very long there, but if I look at one of the bigger roofs, we get smaller ID numbers because it's got a larger power generation. So you want to be able to cross-reference these roofs to your spreadsheet for lookup later. So one way that we can do this is, I don't know if you can see this, there's some buttons in the top left-hand corner. Now one of these buttons is a little pair of binoculars. You may not quite be able to see that. Can everybody see that button there?
Yeah.
If I click on that, it brings up a search box. So let's say I want to look for the biggest roof, the roof with the biggest potential that we saw at the top of that spreadsheet. So if I type 1 in here,
Looks like the pub might be.
I'll click on that. And that actually takes us to Arnside Tower. So the biggest power generation is on Arnside Tower Farm on one of their roofs. And you can see that just confirms it's ID number 1. Those 108 solar panels and an output of 27 megawatt hours over the course of the year. I can do the same with number 2, so I'll just do that. I'll just do it for 1, 2, and 3, and then the smallest roof. So I'll do a search for number 2. And if we do that.
Tom, while you're doing that, when you're giving us this information, sorry, I'm very slow, and I'm sorry that I'm asking questions because I'm the dumbest person around the table, but I think it goes back to your earlier point about, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated, to be clear, but what that represents in terms of amount of power. So when you're giving us this information, am I correct? So this is not a down comment, this is just for understanding, is we don't know yet what percentage of output that could be, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Okay, just so I've got it, doesn't make it unexciting. I'm just trying to understand what I'm looking at, type thing. So cool.
So as a community, I wouldn't mind betting that's pretty close to how much you use.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. So
can I throw in? Sorry, can I throw in a point there? Is that you might find that the total amount generated in Arnside is similar to the total amount of electricity that you use in Arnside, but the issue will be that they won't necessarily occur at the same times. So you're going to get the majority of this in the summer during the daytime, but you're going to use a lot of your electricity at other times of the day. So it's to not kind of get the impression that if the two match, then you don't need any more electricity from the grid. So it'll be a lot of it will be exported into the grid, and you'll still have to buy in a lot of electricity from the grid.
Thank you. That's really helpful perspective. Thanks, Molly.
Can I ask a question too, Tom? Simply, when you've shown the amount of power from each building, the box that comes up shows kilowatt hours rather than megawatt hours, as you said. Is it kilowatt hours or megawatt hours?
Well, I've done it in kilowatt hours because if I do a search here for 914, the smallest roof, and then zoom into that,
yeah,
I see we're now looking at, well, it is 1.1 megawatt hours, so I could do it as megawatt hours, but I have found with this calculation that we get to smaller than that. So yeah, I mean, that point taken, I could do that.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, that smallest roof there is on-site substation. One thing that you don't have in Arnside, just looking around, is that you don't have as many industrial buildings as and kind of massive retail spaces as some of the communities have had, which does mean that you don't have those big roofs, but also a lot of these are residential, so I suppose that is a good thing, and that's what you'll be looking at.
I mean, just separately curious about the school, because Steve and I had a meeting earlier on with the school this afternoon, and this is the primary school that's near the church, and actually there is a eco group in the school, you know, just across the different ages. So I was separately curious to know where the school stacked up in all of this.
Well, just take a step back from that. You're probably all wondering why these are blobs rather than kind of straight kind of geometrical shapes that you might see on a building. And most of the reason is, well, entirely the reason is that this is a mathematical algorithm, and so it's going to just find these areas, and there's noise in the data, and some obstructions that will be found that will be in the way, and because these are only 1 meter by 1 meter pixels, that makes it much harder to work with that noise. But I'm looking at the primary school here, and you can see it has identified several areas suitable for solar, and there's a very good chance that these will be slightly bigger than this because they will be geometrical shapes, or perhaps this is one single roof, but for some reason they can't be identified as such from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Tom?
Yes.
I'm presuming that there's no simple way of adding up these blobs together. So for the church, it's identified it as separate roof slopes, so it's come out of separate blobs. Is there any way of overcoming that to say for that particular shape or that particular building, is this in total, or is it a case of manually adding up from the spreadsheet or manually hovering over to add them up from the map?
I don't have a way of doing that at the moment. You could probably do that within the original software, which is called QGIS. It's like a open source mapping tool that that you can import this data into, or the underlying data at least. So if there was a particular, I mean, a case by case basis, that's possible to do, but from the map, unfortunately not, other than you would have to just hover over each of these roof sections and then cross-reference them with the output, or at least add those up individually. I mean, I suppose it's not too arduous if you're looking at 7 or 8 roof shapes here, 8 roof shapes.
That's fine. That's fine. That's what I thought it would be. It's not kind of possible at this stage. So I suppose it's just to bear in mind when we're looking at the schedule, if we were to approach it from the schedule rather than the map, when they're all listed by size, actually that's not listing buildings by size, that's listing blobs by size. So that actually your biggest roof potential is probably that farm, and that's probably listed in about sort of 10 different locations. So it's just so that when we're kind of looking at the kind of the order of size across the town, we need to just remember that it's not all kind of added up.
Yeah, but as you say, that's not insurmountable anyway.
No,
that's just the homework we can do. So yeah, but that's helpful. Yeah, so we have to do a bit of homework, so that's okay.
I suppose the farm's an interesting one, isn't it? In terms of, it seems like it's got a big potential. It's probably a big consumer of electricity as well, you know. So it could be a good, good one to sort of test, I suppose. That's what I was going to say, Tom. In terms of, presumably you could select based on this a number of random routes to test the accuracy and the potential for solar. Could you? Is that the way you go next with some of this stuff?
Well, in terms of, this is a theoretical calculation, and in terms of like hard evidence linking with real life, there's a community in Keswick that's pretty active. I'm looking at their data, and they have kind of mapped. There's someone there who's been doing some calculations based on 2 or 3 of the roofs there that are they already have solar panels on their roof, so they wanted to see whether that lined up with what was predicted, and it does pretty much line up.
Good to know.
Sorry,
no, good to know that it all correlates. Great.
Did I understand your question right there, Mike?
Yeah, I suppose it's just taking the farm there, for example. It's identified that as a good opportunity, but in terms of understanding, what the real true values are, then that would be presumably an SP installer that did that, would it?
Absolutely, yeah. So this isn't a substitute for like a proper solar survey.
But from what you said, it's reasonably accurate in terms of the size of the price for that particular building.
I couldn't say. I think what's really important is to say it's not really designed for individual buildings as an accurate tool. It's more designed to kind of look at the area as a whole. However, it does give you a good idea, and I wouldn't mind betting that there are several big roof areas on this farm that would be good for solar. So if you see your house on here and it does or does not have solar on it, that's not necessarily a good or a bad guide, but I think, Molly, what you're finding is that it is at least a kind of a way in to get people interested.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I think it's making sure that people understand the limitations on the accuracy on individual buildings. I mean, the instances we've found in Ambleside where there has been a little bit of a mismatch is particularly on very skinny terraces. And I don't know whether that's because of the pixel, and if it's a skinny terrace that's at like a 45-degree angle to north-south, and because of the pixels, it doesn't pick it up as a nice shape that they fit into. There might have been other reasons, but Tom investigated one for us. And, you know, you'd look at the house and you see a lovely kind of south-facing pitch that you could put at least 2 panels deep on, or whatever it might be. But in some particular circumstances, particularly around the small skinny ones, it might not pick up as potential when it does actually have potential. So I think, Tom, you said earlier or previously that it was more of an underestimate than an overestimate. Probably it was on the cautious side.
I would say very much so. There's all sorts of reasons why it's going to be conservative, and one of them is noise in the data that's and artifacts in the original data sets that you can't get past the way they're reconstructed from the way they fly these planes above, they do say that each point is accurate to within 10 centimeters, but that's quite a big difference in angle from one pixel to the next, and you could easily end up with issues there. But as you say, when you've got a thin roof at a 45 degrees angle, and those pixels are kind of zigzagged down that kind of 45-degree angle on the map, it's very difficult to be able to pick out a flat roof from there that's wide enough. The other thing is, in Keswick they have found smaller installations than the cutoff limit that we use here. You'll see it shortly that we use kind of a 16 square meter cutoff limit, but they have found installations that are smaller than that. And whether that means someone's just having a go and sticking one on there anyway, or whether that is actually a thing that installers do in some area, you know, some installers do and some don't, is also interesting. And so I think there are all sorts of reasons why this is conservative.
So you mentioned that you started this back in 2019 in Ambleside. You might be commenting this later, but what has that delivered by way of actual results there, you know, in terms of installations and benefit?
I'll talk about it in detail once Tom's finished, but it's been very slow progress. But yeah, we actually are getting our first installation today started, actually, so everyone was whooping with joy. So we're in Ambleside, we did it more on a theoretical basis, first of all, to develop the software to test out the whole town potential, and it's taken quite a long time to actually develop the project to then engage people around it and find ways in which we can support them to do it. So it's been a very long process in Ambleside, but we're hoping that we are getting to a point where we've got something that we can roll out and will actually start to lead to lots of installations. And obviously we had COVID in the middle of that, when nobody was really doing anything, so quite a bit of a kind of pause in the middle as well.
So is the drive here then to actually try and get a more of a community approach, you know, economy scale type approach to installation of solar panels rather than doing it individually? Is that the idea?
Yes, it is. Shall I just, if you got more to explain to us, Tom, or shall I?
Sorry.
Yeah, I think I will. Shall I carry on just the presentation so you can see?
If that's all right, and then I'll go into all the details about the project afterwards. If that's all right?
It's fine, yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Great questions as always.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'll try and finish this off in terms of like the explanation. So this is what this looks like. Let's take this area here. Oh, hang on, I'm still looking at the web map. No, hang on a minute. You are. Right. Okay. So you should be back with the presentation here. So if we take an area on the map, can you see the map with the area with the promenade and
Yeah.
on the left hand side and the St James's Church? So if we take this sort of medium-sized area, the first stage finds the blobs on the map, if you like, the flat areas, or there's our OS shapes. So the first stage finds all the flat areas. So you can see there are quite a lot of these. So these are potential flat roof areas. So now you can see how these all sort of fit together. And these will have varying angles. Some of these will be roof ridges that are picked out as flat areas. And then once we've made the calculation, you can see the purple areas there, and what you finally get is just the purple areas on their own. So that's just the stages of the algorithm visually. I've just shown you the map, so I won't show you the animation there. So just to talk in a bit more detail about how that calculation is done. So when we do the energy calculation, which is it's actually the third stage, but it could equally be the second stage because they're independent. The third stage of the algorithm was to calculate the energy falling on each point. Each of those points relies on every other point in the map, and those around it in particular. And what we use is kind of a calculation based on direct sunlight and diffuse sunlight, which is effectively what's scattered by clouds and the atmosphere. And in terms of the energy calculation, this is what you get. So obviously this is pixelated once again. We've got that same area again. This is the total energy falling on each point over the course of a year. Excuse me. So that's the kind of the third stage of the algorithm is to do that calculation. Now these calculations tend to take between, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, the shortest ones, and I've just done the Dublin Valley one that I've just done has taken a few weeks. And then in terms of the shadow calculation, what we do is we divide the year up into 4 and look at the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, and look at the shadow on 4 different dates, because it's impossible to calculate that shadow on every single minute of every single day of every single of the whole year. So we take 4 dates spread out amongst the over the year, and we calculate a shadow, what the shadows would look like on those 4 dates. And then we calculate a shadow factor, which is between 0 and 1 based on those shadows. And you'll see this visually shortly. And so 0 means that there's no direct sun on that location, and 1 means that you've got 100% full sunlight all year round. And we eliminate the roofs where the shadow factor over those 4 days comes out to 0.5. So if you look at the shadows in March, we take 2020, but it doesn't really matter which year you do. You can see these are very stark. So this is just direct sunlight. You can see that the south-facing roofs, for example, on the church here, are receiving lots of sunlight, and anything on a north-facing roof gets 0 in terms of direct sunlight. And anything surrounding the building will be in shadow too. So this will start to impact buildings that are kind of put other buildings in the shade, if you like, as well. And this will be impacted also by the hillside that Arnside is built onto. If you look at the June shadows, hang on, there's June. So you see the dune shadows. Well, almost everything is in some sunlight because the sun is almost overhead at midday. So the shadows have very little impact. But in December, you can see lots of very dark areas causing shadows. And December does have a disproportionate effect on the calculation. And I know that installers don't like to install when there's going to be virtually no electricity for that sort of quarter of the year around the solstice, around the winter solstice. And finally, one of the well, actually not finally, but one of the criteria we use is the minimum roof size, and these just give you some figures in terms of a typical solar panel that's installed. And we use the figure of having 6 solar panels to be the smallest array, and you've got to put those in a rectangle, and you've got to have a border around those. So by the time that you've factored all those things in, we take a round figure of 16 square meters to be the smallest viable roof in our calculation. But it is clear that some installers are installing it with smaller installations. And I suspect that with the energy costs that we have at the moment, a smaller installation will be more viable. So there's just a flow chart of how we do the elimination. We eliminate roofs that are less than 16 square meters in size. We eliminate those that are in too much shadow over the course of the year. And then we have to kind of look at roof pitches, which I've called slope here. Any roof that's less than 10 degrees in pitch is considered to be flat, and the reason is that then installers generally will attempt to put panels onto stilts, and the slope's small enough to support that. So for any roof that's flat, we definitely keep that roof. And then we look at the aspect. Is it too north facing? If it's between east northeast and west northwest, which is that sort of slightly bigger than a quadrant at the top of the quadrant, if you like, it's a bit more than a quarter of the angle of the 360 degrees. Anything that's facing north effectively gets eliminated, and any roof that's got a slope, any roof that's got a slope greater than 60 degrees is also eliminated because it's facing too far down towards the horizon to be useful for the midday sun. So we eliminate an awful lot of roofs based on those criteria, and then we keep the rest. This is all in the report that is just being circulated now, I think. Is that right? So I've just talked about some of the limitations before. We've got a low resolution in some parts of the UK where you get more urban areas. You get 1 point every 4, or 4 points every square meter, or 4 points every meter, which means 16 points every square meter, which gives you an awful lot more data to play with and to do the calculation with, and so much more accurate results. As you get less urban, you go to 2 points every meter, and then in rural areas, which is the whole of Cumbria, then you get 1 point every square meter. The original data does have artifacts because of the way they bounce the laser light off the landscape, and there is also noise in the data, so every point isn't 100% accurate. And so yeah, we've already discussed that this is a conservative algorithm, but for all these reasons it's a useful tool for an area as a whole, but not as a survey on individual buildings. But one last graph I want to show you is that if you divide those roofs, and you may not be able to see the scale here, if you carve up those roofs, you take this blue area here is the smallest set of roofs, the set of 25% of smallest areas. So there's those 25% of small roofs, and then the 25% of next smallest roofs, and then the second biggest set of roofs, and then the largest set of roofs here. So those 25% of large roofs is predicted to calculate 57% of the electricity. So there is something to be said for concentrating on and approaching owners of larger roofs for that reason. And that's not to discount the smaller, probably domestic roofs that we've got over here. And that's it. That's all from me. And you've got the map at this address here. So that's available online now. The spreadsheet should be out there at least, I don't know if Molly's circulated that yet, but it's ready to be circulated. And then hopefully this is just information that can arm you for your goal of decarbonising Arnside. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.